Welcome to Funny, They Don't Look Jewish, where Judaism appears in the panels. Our purpose is to find characters, stories, and issues of comics that explore explicitly Jewish content. I'm Henry Bernstein.
And I'm Brandon Bernstein. No relation.
Well, Brandon, we're back in my dining room.
We've made it here again. We've traveled all around the world, except not quite, and wound up back here on the fifth night of Hanukkah, although this holiday will be long gone by the time our listeners are hearing our voices through digital land.
Well, happy Hanukkah and happy holidays to our listeners. Whatever winter solstice holiday you celebrate, happy that to you. It's nice to be recording on Hanukkah. So.
Yeah, it's nice. It's miraculously my laptop has, X amount of battery left, and we'll see if it can last through 8 recordings or something of that sort. It's great to be here. It's great to be diving in, and it's great to be back on the Marvel Comics side of the fence, as we're going to be exploring another Marvel superhero.
Yeah, I have to say I'm both excited and nervous. I think I'm a pretty well-rounded and well-educated comic book fan. Otherwise, I wouldn't be engaging in a venture of doing a comic book podcast. But certainly, as we've established, the DC universe is sort of my playground. What I know, but I do feel fairly confident in my Marvel Comics knowledge. I felt very good about The Thing, Fantastic Four, reading for years. Obviously, Kitty was one of my favorite X-Men, so no problem there. But this is the first time, even Ragman, I knew a little bit about because he was on the Arrow show. I had seen him in DC Comics. But this time, I literally know nothing about Moon Knight. I'm not sure if I'd heard of him before you told me about him. I think I probably maybe have seen him in... on the racks, but it's not like...
We definitely played a game of Marvel Legendary when a friend of ours was Moon Knight as a character, and we had a lot of Moon Knight jokes, and I think he was like, you got it just because you're like, I don't know who that is, and that was the point of the jokes. Moon Knight, I think in some ways he's really comparable to Ragman. He's sort of the Marvel version, except he's had way more miniseries than Ragman has, so I think he's appeared more often. He's one of these really, really beloved C-level heroes. I definitely don't think he's D-level. He sometimes rises up to a B-level, but like Moon Knight's he's definitely a cult hit, and I actually think some of the greatest Marvel comics of the past decade have actually been authors having free range to do whatever they wanted with Moon Knight. Because he's sort of so obscure, often writers have less editorial control over them when they cover Moon Knight, and as a result, he's had some critically acclaimed runs. We're not really going to dive into too many of them today, unfortunately, but let's jump into who this guy is. So listeners, if you're unaware, Moon Knight is real name Marc Spector. He was a U.S. marine-turned-mercenary who, on a mission gone wrong, was left for dead in Egypt. His body was lain before a statue of an Egyptian god, Khonshu, the god of the moon, and he is resurrected by this god and given powers and a new lease on life and a chance to go out and do good in the world as sort of the champion of Khonshu and this defender of the night. A lot of times people refer to Moon Knight as just Marvel's version of Batman, this sort of dark, violent crusader who has lots of money, and instead of batarangs, he has these moon-shaped throwing devices that he has.
Does he have superpowers?
He does not have any superpowers. He's just well-trained. Again, he was both a Marine and then a mercenary, so he knows how to hurt you, and he knows how to hurt you good. He is the Batman of the Marvel Universe in that he is a millionaire who just trained himself how to fight.
Oh.
Right? So quite literally, there's a reason people call him the Batman of the Marvel Universe, and just opposite color scheme, pure white costume with this flowing cape, and really striking visual design. He first appeared in 1975 in an issue of Werewolf by Night, number 32 to be exact, and he appears initially as a villain fighting the werewolf by night, but even by the end of that two-parter, he's already become a hero, and he then appears sporadically in a couple different things like Marvel Spotlight. He ends up joining the Defenders, and in, I think, 1980 or so, he gets his first miniseries. Let's dive in a little bit, though, into who he is. Now, initially, it starts off that Marc Spector, Moon Knight, has multiple guises to help him fight crime and to get to know the underworld. So I think Bruce Wayne actually has similarly, right? Like, what's Bruce Wayne's identity he has when he goes?
Matches Malone.
Matches Malone, like when he wants to go to the skeevy bars in Gotham, right?
Yeah.
So Moon Knight has Stephen Grant, which is his name when he's a wealthy Wall Street millionaire, makes lots of money, becomes a financier of a lot of things. It's a little confusing because it's like he made up an identity that's a millionaire to fund things. It's like, but where'd the millions come from? I don't know enough to know that. And the other is Jake Lockley, who's a cab driver. He's kind of rough and tumble and gruff and on the ground, and while he's giving rides to people, he finds out the dirt on things. So in the early days of Moon Knight, these were just alternate guises that he developed. What ends up happening, however, is that later writers determined that he actually has multiple personalities. Marc Spector actually has dissociative identity disorder, and these are not just fake personas he invented, but they're entire split personalities that he created for himself long ago to deal with childhood trauma. Now, in addition to this, Moon Knight is always joined by his good pal Frenchie, who is Jean-Paul Duchamp, I believe is his real name. Frenchie, who is his pilot and sort of aide. And then, of course, there's also his love interest, Marlene, who accompanies him. The blonde woman, Marlene, who is his beloved. She seems to be, in the issues we're covering today, mostly in a romantic relationship with the Stephen Grant persona. So that's Moon Knight. That's his shtick.
So, Brandon, we're going to be picking things up into a series. So has he, Marc Spector, or any of his aliases always been canonically Jewish?
So glad you asked, Henry. I think it's actually a bit of a dispute. Why don't we go ahead and jump in with Moon Knight's creator, Doug Moench. So in, I think sometime in 2006 or 2007, there was this interview published on a website called Comic Foundry, run by a guy named Tim Leong. And he had a conversation between Doug Moench, again, Moon Knight's creator, and the writer Charles Huston, who had just taken over Moon Knight Volume 5, which ran from 2006 to 2009. So, Henry, why don't you go ahead and read.
Getting back to how much was accidental and incremental, the other thing is, I had a habit of naming characters and stories after friends, and it started spreading. As soon as I had people coming to me saying, when are you going to name a character after me? So I used to go to Ed Summers' comic shop. I think it was called Comic Snipe, something Snipe. It was the best comic shop in Manhattan at the time. And one of the guys that worked there was Marc Spector. And he was saying, when are you going to name a character after me? So then I was trying to figure out this villain for Werewolf by Night. What am I going to call him? I'll name him after Marc Spector. Then it turned out Marc Spector was Jewish. I guess this is a Jewish name. Well, I guess I just made up the first Jewish costumed hero. So maybe I should research some Judaism and stuff about the Mideast and Mossad and all this other stuff, and that's where all that stuff came from. It was all an accident. I didn't say, I'm going to sit down and create a Jewish character.
I love the insight into the creative process, and it's remarkable to me how similar this is to what we heard about the creation of Kitty Pryde, right? John Burns saying, well, I modeled her off of this woman I knew who always wore a Jewish star, so Kitty looked wrong without it, and then Kitty became Jewish. And also, Kitty Pryde's created in like 1980, I think. This character goes to 1975, so he does predate Kitty Pryde. He might be one of our earliest canonically Jewish characters.
Right, because obviously, the thing wasn't until 2002, so it's possible.
The only part that's confusing to me, Henry, is that the issue we're about to cover, which is not written by Doug Moench, is the very first issue to canonically confirm that Moon Knight was Jewish. So, once again, I think similar to Ragman, what we discovered, there seems to be this agreement from creators that the character's Jewish, even though there's never canonical confirmation about it until after that creator is off the book. If you'll recall, I think that happened with Joe Simon and Ragman, that he had created him, intended him to be Jewish, was on the record about him being Jewish, even though we didn't find out he was Jewish till the 1991 series, long after his run. So there's this, I'd be very curious, actually, to know how many comic characters of the 70s and 80s had religious affiliations that the creators knew and we, the audience, were never privy to.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe they talked about it at the Marvel bullpen, and it was like, maybe it was part of that whole carryover from the previous generation of all these writers who were Jewish and just never put that into their comics.
I also wonder if it was some sort of strange, possibly offensive by today's standards, sort of shorthand for people. Like, we're not going to get into it, but like, the character's Jewish, and that tells you a little something about how to write them. Like, I wonder if they had these little sort of shorthands for each other, where it's like, everyone knows this character is this, similar to Seinfeld, right? Everyone knows they're Jewish, they're never going to talk about being Jewish. I wonder if that's how it worked with Moon Knight. The other piece that I want to dive into then, Henry, is some people actually have a lot of criticism for Moon Knight as a Jewish character. And one of those people is where we started this podcast with Mr. Dan Slott. In an episode of the Word Balloon podcast, Dan Slott had a moment to riff a little bit and to reflect on how he felt about Moon Knight as Jewish representation. Let's listen to that clip.
When I was a kid reading comics, I'm very unobservant now, but as a kid, when you're, under the wing of the family, I was far more an observant Jew because I was forced to.
Okay, sure.
And we practiced, but I wouldn't see Jewish heroes. I wouldn't see me in the comics. And it took until, Moon Knight. And then when they showed that, and then Moon Knight, when you think about it, is the worst Jewish character.
I had no idea Moon Knight was Jewish. That's hilarious.
Yeah, he's Jewish,
Okay.
but he's the bad man who's does all this evil stuff, has a near-death experience in a pyramid in front of an Egyptian god. And the ghost of the Egyptian god gives him a second life to be a good person.
That's interesting. Wow. That's
true.
And that is kind of embarrassing.
It's terrible.
All right. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, some harsh words, unfortunately. He picked up on some themes that I think are important, like what does it mean to have a Jewish superhero who was connected to Egyptian mythology? And actually, another writer who picks up on this is Chuck Dixon, most well known for his work, I think, on the Batman titles throughout the 90s.
Yeah, and at the same time as Doug Munch. They were
a team working together.
Right.
Great. So
one was writing Detective, the other one was writing Batman. They switched out,
Amazing. Yeah. So Chuck Dixon wrote the second ever Moon Knight series, which was called Marc Spector Moon Knight. I believe that one started in the late 80s. And he blogged at some time later in the 2000s about this very issue. Henry, do you want to read us what he wrote?
This is what he said. When I wrote Moon Knight over at Marvel, I wanted to explore the fact that Marc Spector was Jewish. I was uncomfortable with the fact that a Jew wielded a power born of Egyptian myth. I wanted to deal with this in a storyline. My editor told me to ignore that aspect of his personality, and I was told this by an editor who is a Jew. Is there something in the mind of comics fandom and professionals that finds religion repugnant, or are they simply avoiding the familiar? Interesting.
Yeah, I think those last lines actually make me think a bit of something you've said of, we come to comics sometimes for escapism, and maybe we don't want to encounter the reality that we know, even though just as many of us come to comics looking for our world reflected. Just to make what we're hinting at clear, obviously this tension and this discomfort comes from the fact that one of the foundational stories about the Jewish people as a nation is the biblical experience of coming out from slavery in Egypt and leaving Egypt and idolatry and all of that behind and being free to then go and serve the monotheistic God. Right. And so the idea of a Jewish superhero who is fully empowered by an Egyptian deity, it's kind of a striking and bizarre one. It's very controversial and almost feels intentionally pointed.
Yeah, it's so funny you said that. I want to be bothered by it. Like, it seems like something that would make me mad. In the past, there are things that have set me off that are, barely anti-Semitic or something, but I somehow read into that. For some reason, it doesn't bother me. Maybe it's because the way I experience the Exodus story is that as a story, as a narrative. And I kind of honestly experience Genesis and Exodus the way I experience comic book narratives. So maybe that's why I'm not bothered by it. It's just sort of, okay, this is like a narrative piece. And as we're seeing, we're recording this, the Parsha leading up to the Torah portion leading up to the end of the Joseph story, the trilogy of the Joseph story, which arguably is, could be the most cinematic story in the Torah. That is, Joseph is tied very heavily to Egypt, and one could argue you wouldn't get slavery without him, the Jewish slavery, the Israelite slavery without him, starting there, and his power there. And then, so you wouldn't get the Exodus then without him, and the power he wielded there. And so maybe there's something about connecting, that Egyptian resurrection brings forth a powerful Jew. I don't know. Maybe there's...
Oh, what an interesting idea. The idea of it is out of Egyptian bondage that we come out stronger than we ever were. What a nice chiddush, Henry, in a good way. I tend to agree with you. It doesn't bother me. I imagine this would bother people more if it was like the Nazis somehow gave him his superpower, or other things that are more temporally close to us.
Right.
I just looked up randomly. I wanted to make sure that Khonshu was a real Egyptian god and not a one made up. And he is. And I actually just found this really fun fact. Maybe we'll close with this.
A real god, not made up.
Well, by which I mean like historically based. Also, I will confess, I daven to Khonshu every night. Thrice daily. No. So...
I had just taken a sip of water as Brett had said that. So there almost was water all over Moon Knight.
You might not have heard any of this podcast, but we were saved. Another Hanukkah miracle. But I just looked up. Apparently, Khonshu in ancient Egyptian, his name means traveler. And of course, we know that the Hebrews are related to the Ivrim, which that Hebrew word also means like to pass by, to travel. So there's actually this really cool connection that the god whose name means traveler ends up empowering a Hebrew whose name also means to pass by or travel. So maybe there is something to it. I don't think it was intended, but it's just neat to see. I agree. So now that we've made these great chiddushes, let's dive into, we only have 3 issues today, Henry. So where are we starting?
All right, we're going to start with Moon Knight Volume 1, number 37. And this was published in May of 1984. The name of the story is Red Sins. It's by writer Alan Zelenetz, penciler Bo Hampton, inker Armando Gil, colorist Ben Shawn, letterer Joe Rosen, editor Denny O'Neil, another Batman connection.
Let's give proper respect to him. This is actually by the writer Rabbi Alan Zelenetz.
Yes, thank you.
Which is amazing!
Yeah.
Right? I think we both know the same thing. Henry, why don't you tell us, what do we know about Alan Zelenetz?
I'm so excited about this. I literally geeked out in my seat while whatever that means, while reading this. Before becoming a film producer, he was a junior high school principal at the Yeshiva of Flatbush, an Orthodox Jewish school in Brooklyn. And one of the science teachers under his supervision was the father of Darren Aronofsky, director of Pi, which he later worked on as the Judaica consultant.
Oh, that part I didn't realize. Yeah. That's amazing. Wow. Yeah, so this guy, he also apparently was the principal of the Solomon Schechter High School of Brooklyn. He's currently the director of the Idea School Institute. So this is a guy who's an Orthodox rabbi who worked in Jewish education, who somehow got involved in writing comic books and film producers. This is my rabbi role model. What an amazing guy. And as you can guess, that means that this 2-part story we're about to dive into is full of some of the most solid Jewish content we have ever seen.
Yeah.
We'll continue to analyze it, but how amazing. I did not ever know that we would encounter a rabbi writing a mainstream superhero comic book. I know the point of this podcast is Davka Jewish content within the pages, but when you learn not only that a creator happens to be Jewish, but that a creator is a rabbi who ran a middle school in Flatbush, goldmine.
Yeshiva of Flatbush, it's a pretty well-known yeshiva.
Yeah.
And total goldmine. And also where we talk about, we started this podcast talking about generations of Jewish writers who didn't talk about their Judaism. Here's an Orthodox Jewish rabbi who embedded it in the fabric of his narrative. Like,
yeah, it's incredible. Thank you so much, Rav Zelenetz. All right, so we dive into the story, and right away on page 1, we're in a hospital in where else? Chicago. Funny how many Jewish characters have roots in Chicago. There is a elderly man dying on a bed, calling for his son Mark. Of course, we're going to find out that son is Moon Knight himself. And a doctor speaking to a young man wearing a kippah who's visiting, who turns out to be a Rabbi Reuben Davis. So this teacher, this educator, this scholar, this rabbi, Moon Knight's father, is dying in a hospital. The young rabbi at his bedside is trying to get permission to sort of act as next of kin, and the hospital staff is insisting, we need his son to be here. So, as you can imagine, word gets by to Marc Spector, going by the alias Stephen Grant, that his father is ill, and we discover that Mark and his father have been estranged for 18 years, which pretty significant number, of course, 18 being chai, being life. I don't know if it's meant to be a lifetime or what it means, like Mark has spent a life without his father, essentially, it seems. This leads to a flashback as Mark on page 5 lets us know about his background. He talks about his parents coming over to the U.S. from Czechoslovakia. They were refugees from the Holocaust. After Hitler started to invade Czechoslovakia, they made their way over. And he says of his father, he knew the Bible and Talmud by heart before he was 15, was ordained a rabbi at 18, and went on to become a brilliant scholar in the Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism.
I wonder if Rabbi Zelenetz, like that was like aspirational writing about them. Like that's like the dream as like a, you know,
is to be like such a Talmud Chacham. Yeah. But like, how poignant is this next line? In America, he was lucky just to be alive. We find out that he grew up on the poor side of Chicago, which I imagine is probably coded language for the south side of Chicago.
Not when he would have come. It would have been a rich and, you know, prosperous and very Jewish time. So I don't know what the poor side of Chicago was at the time of the war. I mean, sure, you know, maybe parts of the southwest side, but yeah, it could be. Yeah.
Okay. His father, who we later find out is Rabbi Elias Spector. Elias one day comes home beaten up by a gang that goes so far as to carve a swastika into his forehead, which, God, the brutality. And we see young Mark wearing a kippah, of course, because his father's an Orthodox rabbi, basically asking his father, what'd you do back to them? How did you fight back? And his father says nothing.
He says, God will punish them. We've enough red sins of our own to atone for. I leave justice to God.
Right, which is like, you can totally buy it as this sort of rabbinic mentality of, I'm not going to fight back. Now, the implication is Mark is really bothered by this, and he wants to fight back. He doesn't want to be a victim in this way. Page 6, we discover that Mark's father, Elias, is appointed to the faculty of the theological seminary, where he wants his son to enroll and become a rabbi. So how amazing would it be to have our first rabbi as superhero? But alas, it doesn't happen. Now, imagine, Henry, that likely they mean a seminary in Chicago, and so likely this is a reference to the Hebrew Theological College, which is also affectionately known as the Skokie Yeshiva.
Right.
It was established in 1921. It is an Orthodox center where there's a lot of different aspects, including a kollel and such, but there is indeed a rabbinic ordaining institution there. So his father is teaching at the Skokie Yeshiva. How cool, right? It's like local here to us in Chicago.
If he's being ordained in Chicago, it would have to be Orthodox because there's no
other, right? Yeah. So Elias discovers that his son has taken up fighting and boxing. Clearly he's been influenced to self-defense, and he discovers him, tries to talk him out of it, actually enters the ring begging his son to give up fighting, and on page 7, Mark punches out his own father. Well, not punches out, but punches his own father in the ring, which is shocking to sort of see.
I mean, he punches him so hard that he goes up. I mean, it was, you know...
It's an uppercut that really sends him flying into the air, at which point... Elias responds, "You want to be an animal? Go, be an animal. but not in my house, not with my blessing, never as my son. And this ends up being the splitting moment that causes Mark to leave and never go home. He sends him off. On page 8, Marlene in the modern day is trying to convince Stephen Grant it doesn't matter that they fought. They should make amends. He'll feel better if they can make amends before losing his father. But Steve goes off to patrol as Moon Knight, and he goes to the Lower East Side where his aunt used to live, and what do you know, on page 9, he discovers a synagogue is burning. Flashbacks to the Batman story we looked at last time with Ragman.
Almost identical looking exterior of the synagogue.
Yeah, a little generic. And then you see a man in a green kippah run into the burning building. Why? To save a Torah scroll, of which Moon Knight reflects the 5 books of Moses. He put his life on the line for this. And on the next page, he thinks, my father would probably have done the same thing, even though he'd never lay a finger to defend himself, right? Like, fascinating sort of tension here of showing, like, he won't risk anything to physically fight, but he'd risk his life to save the Torah scroll.
All right, so this is one of our moments that happens to us all the time where I both equally enjoy something and am annoyed by something, which I'm sure you are too.
Sure.
First of all, so cool to see a superhero hugging a Sefer Torah, or at least holding it.
Right, we didn't bring up, but Moon Knight helps the man rescue the Torah, and you actually see Moon Knight lift up the Torah scroll.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
But it's kind of lame that he refers to it as the 5 books of Moses, not just Torah. And,
on the other hand, better than saying the Old Testament.
Yeah, for sure. No, for sure. So, like, step up, because, like, 5 books of Moses, I imagine he's translating the word Tanakh, Chumash, But, like, Orthodox rabbi writer, he probably should have just said Torah.
But to be fair, I mean, I'll defend this because the panel before has the man who ran in after it saying the Torah scroll.
Yeah.
Right? He declares it that, and then Moon Knight thinks the 5 books of Moses. I think this is a writer who very savvily, or in a very savvy way, is defining his terms for an audience who he thinks might not know what a Torah is.
Okay, all right, cool. So good, that explains that. What about the nonsense letters on the Torah?
There's a bunch of Hebrew letters that don't seem to mean anything. It looks like it's maybe like Vav Samech Resh Yud Ayin. Yeah, I'm not sure. I wondered if what looks like Vav Samech Resh was actually supposed to be Chet Samech Daled, like if it was Chesed.
I don't know.
I really don't know. I'm not so bothered by it. I hear you.
Yeah, it's a little annoying.
It's a little annoying, but it's
not
amazing
as
to see it.
annoying as Ragman and the rabbi kneeling down in prayer.
No, nothing is. Moon Knight makes his way out. The Jewish community is so relieved to have both the Torah and the man saved, and that's when Moon Knight turns around and discovers that the synagogue has also been spray painted with a swastika. Clearly there is some hatred happening in New York City this evening, and then we are off for Moon Knight to hunt some neo-Nazis. Yes. And God, something so satisfying about Jewish superheroes hunting down white supremacists. It's amazing. We get a few pages. We don't really need to spend too much time here where Moon Knight goes and confronts them, but I want to point out at one point he reflects to himself, it's not enough to leave justice to God's sweet time, right? You can't, God acts sometimes too slowly, and Moon Knight's taking action into his own hand. He dives in, and on page 13 to 14, as he's fighting these guys, I just want to read a little bit. They tell Moon Knight, this here's private property. And Moon Knight responds, so's the synagogue you turned into a flaming holocaust, you rotten son of a pig. To which the neo-Nazis there say, hey, what's a Jew church to you? I loved everything about this. I love that he makes the direct comparison to Holocaust. Yeah. I love that he's so enraged. I love the fact that you have these people who are so ignorant that they don't call it a synagogue, they just call it a Jew church.
And it's probably something that the writer probably heard that derogatory totally once or something, felt familiar.
And then, like, another amazing, at one point, Moon Knight holds one of the guys out the window by his ankles and says, I belong with the persecuted. Mm-hmm. Like, This issue also makes me just think so much, this is Marvel's version of Ragman, right? Like, Ragman was the hero of the downtrodden. 100% this is Moon Knight saying, I am a superhero for the people who feel they don't have a superhero. I stand with the persecuted. Today especially, what an incredibly powerful image to have a Jewish superhero saying, I stand with the persecuted. Moon Knight is especially violent in his taking down. A detective comes and stops him and sort of reflects that had Moon Knight been a police officer, he would have charged him with police brutality. On the one hand, it's rough to see a superhero being so violent. And on the other hand, I think it's a glimpse into how much this anti-Semitism bothers him, right? Like, he is grieving for his father. He wouldn't react this way if he didn't deep down care deeply about his Judaism. All right, so by page 17, Mark has decided to fly to Chicago with Marlene joining him. It's very sweet. And Mark gets back in time, but very sadly reflects, had he only left a little earlier, he might have had time with his father while his father was still alive. They just made it in time for the funeral, which also, it seems like it's a matter of one day. So I love that they accurately got, right? In Judaism, when someone dies, you have that funeral as soon as possible, right? This isn't weeks later. It sounds like he missed his father by a day, if that, and the funeral's already happening. I love that accuracy. Walks into a place that clearly looks like people are Orthodox in dress, but there's no division of gender, although I don't think there is, even at a funeral. I don't think you have a mechitza up.
I don't know. I mean, I certainly have never been to a funeral where there was, and I've been to funerals of Orthodox people, but you never know.
You never quite know.
But there is something funny.
Yeah, tell us about it.
All right, so this guy comes up to him and wearing kippah and says, "Excuse me, sir, would you mind covering your head?" As Mark's putting on the kippah, and he hands him a kippah, and as Mark's putting it on, he says, "I've come back, Papa. I can only believe that's what you wanted." And I just sort of chuckled a little bit at the idea of someone coming up to someone and asking them to put on a kippah, because I sort of live in two worlds with this, where on the one hand, I'm constantly chasing around my students and annoying them to put on a kippah because it's part of dress code, and definitely I teach Judaic studies. When we're learning Torah, they should be wearing a kippah and in tefillah and all that. They always don't have it. They shoved it into their pocket. It's like middle schoolers are like allergic to wearing kippah for some reason.
Yeah.
So I can relate to that. On the other hand, the spiritual community that I pray in never would embarrass someone coming to that. Now, and of course there are varying degrees of that. It just kind of made me chuckle. Right. It felt like a real thing that would happen in a synagogue.
And it does read to me as fairly polite. Like, he says, "Excuse me, would you mind?" Like, it feels very sweet. So then we see that Rabbi Reuben Davis, the guy who was in the hospital bed with Mark's father earlier, is giving the hesped, is giving the eulogy. Lets us know that we're all gathered here to pay final tribute to Rabbi Elias Spector of sainted memory, which I think has to be an English translation. It feels to me like likely what he actually said was Zecher Tzadik Livracha, right? May his righteous memory. I think a tzaddik, a righteous person, is the closest Jews really get to a saint. Yeah. So I actually think that our author is very good about translating terms he knows non-Jews won't get into English. So he says of sainted memory, and he says that his eternal soul might bask in the heavenly glory of God. Once again, hearing a lot of the stuff in English just sounds Christian, but I really do think he's just translating what probably would have been in Hebrew. On page 18, he continues delivering the eulogy. We see a flashback image of Rabbi Spector poring over Hebrew books.
This is such a cool page.
It's an incredible image.
We'll put it up. I'll put it up on the Facebook page like I always do. It's really cool.
But you see Rabbi Spector in the vibrancy of his life, because he's not gray-haired. He has dark black hair, sitting down, poring over books. You see a book that, once again, I was disappointed that I couldn't quite tell what the title of this book was. You see, it looks like Lamed Yud Ayin Nun, Liya'an, perhaps, which maybe is a variation of like to answer. It's a book of answers, perhaps, or to reply, I was thinking of. The other option is what looks like a final nun might be a resh, and maybe it's like to the forest, Liya'ar. I don't know what this book is. But it's this gorgeous image of Rabbi Spector over the books with a candelabra near him. And I appreciate that it's not a menorah, it's not a Chanukiah, it's just a candelabra, because we don't only use those for light. Right. And below it, You see Mark growing up, becoming a soldier, becoming Moon Knight, and it's meant to parallel the journey of father and son. And I really feel like I want to read this whole bit here, Henry, if you don't mind. Mm-hmm. In his religious and mystical studies, Elias Spector struggled for the knowledge to see beyond the physical, to know the universe as a reflection of the divine image, and to see mankind redeemed, as it is written in the visions of Isaiah, "Come now, and let us reason together, saith the Lord. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be white as snow. Though they be red like crimson, they shall be as wool." He's quoting Isaiah 1:18. It's this beautiful image. And, Henry, I learned when I was in rabbinical school the importance of checking out surrounding verses of any proof text to realize why it's being there. Clearly, what he's basically saying is he's referencing a verse in Isaiah that seems to say, right now you've sinned, right now things are bad, but you will find redemption. You will be cleansed of these sins in some way. The Jewish view might be tshuva. I want to dive into the verses surrounding it, but not quite yet, because this verse is going to pop up later, and I'll explain why later. But we get this beautiful eulogy, and then he starts to move on to the language of Psalm 23, right? As it says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Adonai ro'i lo echsar," a traditional psalm read at Jewish funerals. So I really appreciate the accuracy going on here. Mark goes on, meets Reuben Davis directly. They get a chance to chat. On page 20, Mark goes to visit his father's grave. He's apparently going after hours because the Jewish cemetery seems to be closed, so he has to sneak in. And he discovers that there's these young hoodlums vandalizing the grave and spray painting a swastika. So Mark engages in a fight with them. On page 22, you see a thug who's so big that he lifts an entire Jewish gravestone from the ground. He breaks it up and is going to hit Mark with it. But then, in an amazing moment to show their partnership and also that Mark's not the only hero, Marlene takes out that thug and saves his life. And they discover, while interrogating these hoodlums, that someone paid them to desecrate the graves. And then they turn and discover that Mark's father's grave is now empty. The body is missing, the casket is missing, and on the final page of this issue, we see a hooded figure in what looks like purple robes. It almost looks like a purple version of a KKK member's uniform, or like another Marvel character, the Hate Monger, and he's standing over the casket of Rabbi Spector. And this costumed villain has stolen Moon Knight's father's body, and to be continued to the next issue. We're going to dive into it, but Henry, what do you think of this issue so far?
Yeah, so I really loved it, and this was my first issue of Moon Knight ever that I've ever read, and I absolutely loved it. And I loved the last page, and I definitely thought, oh, that looks like a grand wizard for sure, and we'll talk about that in the next issue when we get to know this hooded figure more. It's weird that the casket has a window in it so you can see the father's face. I don't know. It's almost like it's saving it for a science experiment.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is one where it's just like a comic artist taking liberties to make it easy to identify who it is.
But I really enjoyed it. It was great.
It was great. The Judaism was just sort of naturally weaved into it, and I 100% buy. It's sort of like what Carl Kiesel did with that Thing issue, where Thing has lived his whole life away from Judaism and then flashes back to the important role it played in his childhood. And I can totally buy Marc Spector, or Stephen Grant as he's currently known, with his blonde, likely not Jewish girlfriend, having left Judaism long behind and then having a family emergency that pulls him back and suddenly diving into this Jewish heritage he thought he left behind. It's just really, it feels organic to me. It feels beautiful. I just love it.
Yeah.
And for right now, I'm Brandon Bernstein.
I'm Henry Bernstein.
No relation.
Join us next time for part 2 of Moon Knight. Until then, you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Jewish Comics Pod, and you can email us at jewishcomicspodcast@gmail.com.